Welcome back to the channel. Just hours ago, the world woke up to something that no analyst, no diplomat, and certainly no one inside the White House ever expected to see from America's quietest, most polite, most reliably cooperative neighbor, Canada, the nation that Americans have spent 2 centuries treating as a harmless afterthought, a friendly attic sitting above the world's most powerful country, a maple-scented doormat that says sorry when you step on it, told the President of the United States, in the most diplomatically devastating language uttered by a Canadian Prime Minister since Confederation in 1867, to go to hell. Not in those exact words. The diplomatic language was more refined, but the meaning was unmistakable. The tone was ice cold, and the reaction from the White House was so immediate, so volcanic, and so strategically incoherent that it confirmed everything this channel has been saying for months about the state of American foreign policy under this administration. On May 5th, 2026, at approximately 1400 hours Eastern Time, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa, flanked by his foreign minister and his defense minister, a visual staging that was itself a message, and announced that Canada was suspending all bilateral trade negotiations with the United States, imposing retaliatory tariffs on 127 categories of American goods, initiating emergency energy export diversification agreements with the European Union and Japan, and this is the part that sent the White House into a full institutional meltdown, activating Article 5 consultation procedures within NATO to discuss whether American trade actions against a NATO ally constitute a threat to allied security and cohesion. But on this channel, we do not just read the headlines. We look at the reality behind them. And the reality behind Canada's declaration of economic independence from the United States is more consequential, more strategically dangerous, and more revealing of American vulnerability than anything the mainstream commentators have been willing to say. Why did Canada choose this moment to break from Washington? What leverage does Ottawa actually hold that makes this more than a symbolic protest? How did President Trump's trade war against America's closest ally create the exact conditions that are now threatening to fracture the most important military alliance in the world? And why is the White House melting down, not just politically, but strategically, in a way that suggests the administration did not understand until this week what Canada actually means to American national security? Stay with us, because the full picture is more shocking than any single headline conveys. If you want raw, no-nonsense analysis that cuts through the noise, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story is about to reshape your understanding of the North American continent. To understand why Canada's move is not a tantrum, but a strategic earthquake, you have to understand what Canada actually provides to the United States, not in the language of diplomatic communiques, but in the language of hard numbers that no amount of presidential bluster can change. Canada is the largest single supplier of energy to the United States. Not the Middle East, not Venezuela, not Mexico, Canada. In 2025, Canada exported approximately 4 million barrels of crude oil per day to the United States, representing roughly 60% of total American crude oil imports. That oil flows through a network of pipelines, including the Enbridge Line 5, which carries over 500,000 barrels per day through Michigan and supplies roughly half of Ontario and Quebec's energy needs, as well as refineries in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and the American Midwest. The Keystone pipeline system carries approximately 620,000 barrels per day from Alberta's oil sands to refineries in Illinois, Oklahoma, and the Gulf Coast. If Canada redirects even a fraction of this energy flow to other markets, and the emergency diversification agreements announced by Carney are designed to do exactly that, American refineries that are calibrated to process Canadian heavy crude will face supply disruptions that cannot be compensated for by domestic production or alternative imports within any time frame shorter than 2 to 3 years. But oil is only the beginning. Canada is the largest supplier of electricity to the United States, exporting roughly 62 terawatt hours of hydroelectric power annually to American states including New York, New England, Michigan, Minnesota, and the Pacific Northwest. Canadian hydroelectricity keeps the lights on in American cities that most Americans do not realize are dependent on a foreign power grid. The interconnection is so deep that New York City receives approximately 15% of its total electricity from Hydro-Quebec, a Canadian crown corporation supplying power to the most iconic city in the United States through undersea transmission cables that no tariff can replicate and no domestic producer can replace on any timeline that matters. Canada is also the largest supplier of natural uranium to the United States, providing approximately 14% of America's reactor fuel, the fuel that generates roughly 20% of all American electricity through nuclear power plants. Canada is the largest source of American potash imports, essential for agriculture. Canada is the largest source of American softwood lumber imports, without which the American home building industry cannot function at current volumes. The total bilateral trade relationship is worth approximately $900 billion annually, making it the single largest trading partnership between any two nations on Earth. In an era when the White House talks endlessly about energy independence and energy dominance, the uncomfortable reality is that the United States is deeply, structurally, inescapably dependent on Canadian goods and energy in forms that range from crude oil to electricity to uranium to the raw materials that build American homes and feed American soil. Then there is the defense dimension, which the White House's trade war has managed to catastrophically overlook. Canada and the United States jointly operate the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, the integrated air and missile defense system headquartered inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado that provides the primary warning and response architecture against ballistic missile attacks, bomber incursions, and aerospace threats to the North American continent. NORAD is not an American system with Canadian participation. It is a binational command, the only permanent binational military command in the world, with a Canadian deputy commander, Canadian radar stations across the Arctic, and Canadian CF-18 interceptor aircraft, soon to be replaced by 88 F-35A Lightning II fighters under a $12.8 billion Canadian procurement that fly intercept missions against Russian bombers approaching North American airspace through the Arctic corridor. In the last 2 years alone, NORAD has conducted a significant increase in intercept operations as Russian Tu-95 Bear and Tu-160 Blackjack strategic bombers have probed North American air defenses with growing frequency, testing response times and radar coverage along routes that pass directly over Canadian Arctic territory. Canada's geographic position is not optional for American continental defense. The shortest flight path for a Russian nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missile or a strategic bomber approaching the United States from Russia crosses directly over Canadian territory. The radar stations of the North Warning System, a chain of detection sites stretching across the Canadian Arctic from Labrador to the Yukon, provide the critical early warning data that gives American missile defense systems, including the ground-based mid-course defense interceptor stationed at Fort Greely in Alaska and Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, the time to detect, track, and engage incoming threats. Without Canada's active cooperation, NORAD's early warning architecture has a hole in it the size of a continent, and no amount of presidential bluster can fill a hole that size. This is the leverage that Prime Minister Carney is wielding, and it is leverage that the White House, consumed by the self-proclaimed greatest deal-maker in history's conviction that trade wars are easy to win, apparently failed to calculate before launching a tariff regime that has pushed America's most important ally past the point of diplomatic tolerance. The tariff dispute that triggered Canada's response has been escalating since early 2025, when the administration imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum imports, expanded it to include Canadian automotive parts and softwood lumber, and then, in the move that reportedly shattered what remained of Ottawa's willingness to absorb American provocations, threatened to impose tariffs on Canadian energy exports, including crude oil and refined petroleum products. The energy tariff threat was described by Canadian trade officials as crossing a line that no previous American administration, regardless of party, had ever approached. Canadian officials pointed out with controlled fury that Canada has been the most reliable energy partner the United States has ever had, supplying oil through every crisis, every war, every sanctions regime, never once weaponizing its energy exports, never once threatening to redirect supply for political leverage, never once demanding anything more than fair market prices and basic reciprocal respect. Taxing Canadian oil would raise prices for American consumers, disrupt the integrated North American energy market that both nations have spent decades building, and send a signal that the United States considers its most reliable energy partner a hostile economic actor rather than a continental ally. The response from Ottawa was not what the White House expected. It was not polite. It was not diplomatic. It was economic warfare, conducted with the cold precision of a central banker who has spent his entire career understanding exactly where financial pressure points are located and exactly how hard to press them. Carney's response was calibrated with the precision of a man who spent 13 years running two of the world's most important central banks, the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, before entering politics. He did not respond with rhetoric. He responded with policy. The retaliatory tariffs on 127 categories of American goods target politically sensitive export sectors in states that are critical to the current administration's electoral coalition. Bourbon from Kentucky and Tennessee, agricultural machinery from Wisconsin and Iowa, dairy products from upstate New York, and technology components from Texas and California. The targeting is not random. It is surgical. Each tariff line corresponds to a congressional district, and each congressional district corresponds to a calculation about where economic pain will translate into political pressure on the White House to back down. But the retaliatory tariffs are the conventional response. The unconventional response, the response that sent the White House into what multiple outlets are describing as a full-scale policy crisis, is the NATO Article 5 consultation request. Article 5 is the mutual defense clause that states an attack on one ally is an attack on all. Canada is not invoking Article 5 itself. What Canada has done, in a move of extraordinary diplomatic creativity, is request formal consultations under Article 4, which allows any ally to bring to the table any issue it believes affects its territorial integrity, political independence, or security. Canada's argument, laid out in a formal diplomatic note to NATO Secretary General, is that American trade actions against a NATO ally, when they target the energy and defense industrial base of that ally and threaten to undermine its economic stability, constitute a challenge to allied cohesion that warrants collective discussion. The legal merits of this argument are debatable. The political impact is not. By bringing the U.S.-Canada trade dispute into the NATO framework, Canada has internationalized the bilateral fight and forced every NATO ally in Europe to take a position on whether America's trade war against its own allies is compatible with the spirit of the alliance. In the White House, the reaction was immediate, furious, and revealing. The president's social media posts in the hours following Carney's announcement described Canada as ungrateful, disloyal, and taking advantage of American generosity. Language that, whatever its domestic political utility, confirms to every American ally in the world that the current administration views alliance relationships not as strategic partnerships, but as transactional arrangements in which loyalty flows upward to Washington and gratitude is the expected return. The National Security Council reportedly convened an emergency meeting to assess the NORAD implications of the Canadian announcement. The Pentagon, caught between its institutional commitment to the Canadian Defense Partnership and the White House's trade agenda, issued a statement emphasizing the enduring nature of the U.S.-Canada defense relationship, a statement that was widely interpreted as the Pentagon's way of publicly distancing itself from the trade war without directly contradicting the commander-in-chief. In Moscow, the reaction was one of barely concealed satisfaction. Russia's strategic interest in the Arctic has been growing for years, and the Russian military has invested heavily in Arctic bases, icebreaker fleets, and the deployment of S-400 air defense systems and MiG-31BM interceptor aircraft, a platform capable of carrying the Kinzhal hypersonic missile with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers at speeds above Mach 10 to positions along Russia's northern coastline. Any fracture in the U.S.-Canada defense partnership, any degradation of NORAD cooperation, any reduction in Canadian willingness to host American early warning infrastructure creates opportunities for Russian Arctic strategy that Moscow could not have engineered through its own actions. The Americans are handing Russia a strategic gift, wrapped in tariffs and tied with a bow of diplomatic incompetence, and Moscow does not even have to send a thank you note. In Beijing, the reaction has been strategic and opportunistic in ways that should terrify every national security planner in Washington. China has been seeking to expand its economic footprint in Canada, particularly in the critical minerals sector. Canada holds some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements, the minerals essential to electric vehicle batteries, advanced electronics, and the military technologies that will define 21st century warfare. Canada's reserves of nickel alone are estimated at over 6 million metric tons, and its cobalt reserves rank among the top 5 in the world. Previous Canadian governments have blocked Chinese investment in these sectors under pressure from Washington, most notably the forced divestiture of Chinese mining investments in Canadian lithium operations in 2022. If the U.S.-Canada relationship deteriorates to the point where Ottawa no longer feels obligated to align its economic policy with American security preferences, the door to Chinese investment in Canadian critical minerals swings open, a development that would give Beijing access to strategic resources in America's own backyard, literally across the border, that the United States has spent years and billions of dollars trying to deny to Chinese companies. Chinese state media has already begun framing the U.S.-Canada trade dispute as evidence of American alliance dysfunction, broadcasting the story extensively to audiences in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America as a cautionary tale about the reliability of American partnership. Across European capitals, the reaction has been one of uncomfortable solidarity with Canada, layered over deep anxiety about the precedent. Every NATO ally in Europe maintains a trade relationship with the United States, and every one of them has experienced or feared the same kind of tariff pressure that Canada is now pushing back against. Germany, whose automotive industry has been threatened with American tariffs on multiple occasions, is watching Canada's response with particular intensity. France, which has long advocated for European strategic autonomy and has clashed repeatedly with Washington over trade and technology policy, has reportedly signaled through diplomatic channels its willingness to support Canada's Article 4 consultation request at the NATO level. Canada's Article 4 move forces European allies to choose: support Canada and risk provoking American economic retaliation against their own economies, or stay silent and signal to Washington that allies can be bullied one at a time without collective consequence. The European calculation, according to diplomatic reporting, is leaning towards support for Canada, not out of altruism, but out of self-interest. If Canada's pushback succeeds in restraining American trade aggression, it establishes a precedent that protects European allies from the same treatment. If Canada fights alone and loses, every European ally knows it becomes the next target. In Tokyo and Seoul, the concern is acute and immediate. Japan and South Korea are both heavily dependent on American security guarantees. Both maintain significant trade relationships with the United States, and both have experienced trade pressure from the current administration. Japan on automotive exports, South Korea on semiconductor and steel exports. Canada's response: retaliatory tariffs plus alliance framework escalation, is being studied in both capitals as a template for their own potential responses to American economic coercion. The implications for the American alliance network in Asia are significant. If the US-Canada template becomes the norm, American tariffs met with allied retaliation and alliance framework challenges, then the transactional approach to alliances that this administration has pursued will produce not compliance, but coordinated resistance across the entire American partner network, from Ottawa to Brussels to Tokyo to Seoul. The lessons from Canada's stand are already reverberating through every alliance relationship America maintains. First, geography is leverage, and Canada has more of it than Washington understood. The United States cannot defend its own continent without Canadian cooperation. It cannot maintain its Arctic early warning capability without Canadian territory. It cannot run its Midwest refineries without Canadian oil. It cannot power its northeastern cities without Canadian hydroelectricity. These are not diplomatic abstractions. They are physical realities that no tariff schedule can change. The self-proclaimed greatest deal-maker in history picked a trade fight with the one nation whose geographic and economic integration with the United States makes it genuinely irreplaceable, and then appeared surprised when that nation used its irreplaceability as a weapon. Second, the alliance framework is being turned against its creator. The United States built NATO to project American power and protect American interests. Canada is now using NATO's own consultation procedures to challenge American policy. The tool that Washington designed to coordinate allies under American leadership is being repurposed to constrain American unilateralism. This is not a malfunction of the system. It is the system working exactly as it was designed, protecting allies from threats, including threats that originate from within the alliance itself. Third, the White House meltdown reveals the administration's fundamental misunderstanding of power. The president believes that trade wars are fought with tariffs and won by the larger economy. Canada has demonstrated that trade wars between allies are fought with leverage, energy leverage, defense leverage, alliance leverage, geographic leverage, and that the larger economy does not always hold the stronger hand when the smaller economy controls resources that the larger economy cannot replace. Fourth, the era of quiet Canadian compliance is over. For generations, Canada has been America's most accommodating ally, absorbing insults, accepting unequal trade terms, providing military support in every American conflict from Korea to Afghanistan, without demanding reciprocal attention, and asking for nothing more than to be treated with basic respect. That era ended on May 5, 2026. Canada's new posture is not anti-American. It is pro-Canadian in a way that previous Canadian governments never had the political courage or the economic leverage to sustain. Mark Carney, the central banker turned prime minister, is treating the U.S.-Canada relationship the way he treated monetary policy, with cold mathematical precision, zero sentimentality, and a willingness to take dramatic action when the data demands it. Fifth, the White House has demonstrated to every adversary on earth that the fastest way to weaken American power is not to attack it, but to wait for it to attack itself. Russia did not need to sabotage NORAD. China did not need to hack the North Warning System. Iran did not need to disrupt Canadian oil flows to American refineries. The White House did all of this damage on its own, through a tariff policy that treated an indispensable ally like an economic adversary, and then reacted with surprise and fury when that ally responded accordingly. The most dangerous threat to American national security in May 2026 is not coming from Moscow or Beijing or Tehran. It is coming from a trade policy designed without any apparent consultation with the national security establishment that depends on the relationships that policy is destroying. The old relationship, the one in which Canada said sorry and America said nothing, the one in which Canadian oil flowed south and Canadian soldiers deployed east, and Canadian radar stations watched north, and America never once stopped to consider what would happen if all of that stopped, is finished. The new relationship is being built on leverage, reciprocity, and the hard mathematics of interdependence. And the White House, which started this fight believing it was punishing a dependent client state, is discovering in real time that the dependency runs in both directions, and that the nation it took for granted is the one it can least afford to lose. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. What do you think? Does the White House back down and negotiate, or does it double down and risk fracturing the alliance that protects the entire North American continent? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this analysis opened your eyes, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a briefing. Until next time, stay sharp.